A single, crumbling scroll holds a secret that could shatter the foundations of elven history. In the hushed silence of the great library of Imladris, the keeper of histories, Elrond, unrolls this fragile parchment. His fingers trace faded ink that whispers of the Firstborn's fading, a slow decay of the Eldest Lineages that has haunted his people for ages. He is driven by one urgent goal: to understand why the light of the Eldar is dimming before it is extinguished forever. By the end of this journey, you will uncover the hidden truth behind the fall of the world's first and most powerful beings. This quest for forgotten truths risks awakening ancient sorrows and forbidden knowledge long left undisturbed. It begins with a single question etched in dust, a mystery of a lost seed of discord and the true weight of an ancient doom. I am curious to know, wherever you are listening from right now, what does the fading of a great civilization bring to your mind? The quiet of the library was broken by a single, resonant bell. Its chime echoed through the hidden corridors of Imladris, a summons not heard for many long years. Elrond had called a council, a secret gathering of the few remaining lore masters and the scattered descendants of the eldest elven houses. They came in silence, their faces etched with the light of ages and a shared, unspoken dread. Within the circular chamber, under the soft glow of crystal lamps, Elrond laid the fragile scroll upon a table of polished wood. He did not speak of vague portents or poetic sorrows. He spoke plainly of his fear, the fear that their very essence, the light of the Eldar, was not simply fading but being actively undone. This blunt honesty shattered the comfortable melancholy that had long defined their existence. It forced the assembly to confront the raw reality of their decline, a truth they had whispered about but never dared to name aloud. A sharp division fractured the room's solemn peace. Some argued passionately for letting the past lie, for accepting this long twilight as the natural end of their song. To them, prying into such ancient matters was not wisdom, but a dangerous folly, a risk of awakening griefs better left slumbering. But others countered with equal fire, their voices ringing with a desperate conviction. They believed that to ignore this mystery was to surrender to the dark, that understanding the nature of their fall was the only hope, however faint, of perhaps halting it. This was no longer a philosophical debate. It was a struggle for the soul of their people, and as the arguments clashed, hidden agendas began to surface. Whispers of old grievances, of lineages that held themselves purer than others, of secrets kept even from a lord like Elrond, now seeped into the open, escalating the stakes beyond mere knowledge. The weight of their shared history, a tapestry woven with both glorious light and terrible shadow, now pressed down upon them, demanding a choice. The sheltered safety of their halls had become a cage. The only path forward, they finally agreed, was to seek answers in the wider, more dangerous world, to places where the memory of the Firstborn had turned to dust and legend. Their destination was a city of ghosts, Ost-in-Edhil, where the very air tasted of rust and regret. Guided by a single cryptic verse from the scroll, Elrond and the Noldor smith Celebrían moved through streets reclaimed by thorny vines and silent stone. The verse spoke of a truth buried not in a tomb, but beneath a monument, a testament to pride and its tragic cost. They stood before the broken statue of Celebrían, the great craftsman lord, his stone eyes still gazing defiantly at a sky that had witnessed his city's ruin. The verse was clear. The truth lay directly below his feet, but the ground itself was a guardian. Ancient, lingering wards, spells woven by Celebrimber's own guild to protect their secrets, hummed with a faint, malevolent energy. To approach carelessly was to invite a swift and silent end, a dispersal of one's very spirit into the cold wind. This was not a battle of strength, but a delicate contest of wisdom against the stubborn, defensive magic of a fallen, more potent age. Celebrían, her hands still remembering the craft of her people, traced the invisible patterns in the air, her mind seeking the rhythm of the old enchantments. Elrond lent his own deeper power, his voice a soft counter-melody to the ward's dissonant hum. It was a slow, painstaking unraveling, a dance on the edge of a blade. Finally, with a sigh like a released breath, the protective field dissolved. They dug with their hands, the cold soil giving way to reveal not a chest or a casket, but a flat, dark stone tablet, its surface etched with angular runes. Brushing away the earth, they began to decipher the message. The runes spoke of alliances and great works, but then came a stark shift in the language. They found the first chilling mention of the seed of discord. This was not a tale of a monstrous enemy from the outside. The words pointed to a flaw within, a bitterness sown among the elves themselves, a secret schism that festered long before any open war. The true enemy, it seemed, had always been closer than anyone dared to believe. This single fragment of stone, heavy with accusation, now directed them onward, to a place where water whispered and memory slept. The cold water of the pool soaked through Celebrían's robes, a shock that promised either clarity or oblivion. At the edge of the misty falls, where the roar of Nen Hithol faded to a constant, hushed murmur, she closed her eyes and let her spirit merge with the liquid memory of the world. The water was not merely water here. It was a chronicle, a witness that had collected the sorrows of ages. Her mind reached out, seeking the specific resonance of that first, terrible fracture the stone tablet had hinted at. For a long moment, there was only the chill and the sound of falling water. Then the vision crashed over her. She was no longer at the falls. She stood on a shore of gleaming pearls and white stones, under a light that was not the sun. This was Alqualanda, the Swan Haven, in the years of the trees, but the scene was not one of beauty. It was chaos. The air was thick with terrible cries and the clash of metal against wood. She saw not elves as the wise, ancient beings she knew, but as figures twisted by a desperate, blinding fury. Noldor, her own kin, their eyes burning with a fey light, were attacking the Teleri, their own kindred, who fought back with oars and fishing spears. The pristine white sand was churned to mud and stained a deep, shocking crimson. This was the kinslaying, not a story from a scroll, but a raw, visceral truth. She felt the betrayal in the water itself, the shock and terror of the Teleri, as their beautiful swan ships were seized by force. She saw the faces of the Noldor, not as monsters, but as people she might have called family, their features contorted by a conviction so absolute it justified any atrocity. The weight of it crushed her, a suffocating blanket of inherited guilt. The foundational purity of her lineage, the noble history of the Noldor she had always held sacred, shattered in that instant. They were not innocent exiles. They were murderers, and their great journey was built upon a foundation of blood. Stumbling back onto the bank, she fell to her knees, gasping, the physical world returning in a dizzying rush. Elrond was at her side instantly, his steadying hand on her shoulder. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new, haunted knowledge, and she told him everything. She poured out the vision, the horror, the blood on the sand, the brutal truth of that first and most damning schism. In sharing this painful wound, their alliance deepened into something far stronger, a bond forged in the acknowledgement of a shared, terrible heritage. But the confession also laid a raw emotional wound bare between them. The quest was no longer an intellectual puzzle, it was a personal penance. The fating of their people was not a mystery, it was a consequence, a curse earned in a moment of blind rage on a distant, forgotten shore. As she finally found her breath, her gaze and Elrond's was drawn irresistibly upward to the cold, clear points of light in the darkening sky. The very stars that had looked down upon the first exiles as they began their long, sorrowful march now seemed to hold the next fragment of the answer. The stars themselves seemed to mock them with their cold, perfect patterns. To find answers for a crime born of blood, they now had to seek wisdom from the one who spoke only to the heavens. Menelmacar, the stargazer, was his name, a recluse who had turned his back on the troubles of the earth to dwell in a solitary tower that pierced the clouds. Its pale spire was a needle threading the sky, a place where the air was thin and the only sound was the endless wind. They found the great oak door locked not by any physical mechanism, but by a puzzle of light and shadow. The chamber within was circular and open to the elements, its floor a vast mosaic of inlaid crystal. Etched around the perimeter were the names of ancient constellations, their patterns long forgotten by all but this one isolated sage. Elrond approached the puzzle with the methodical patience of a lore master, his mind a library of star charts and celestial movements. He began aligning luminous crystals into slots on the floor, each click echoing in the silence as he tried to reconstruct the old configurations. But his logic was earth-bound, tied to scrolls and reason. The stars, he was learning, obeyed a different kind of law. One misplaced crystal, one fraction of an inch out of alignment, and the tower's defense awoke. The solid floor beneath his feet vanished. Suddenly, he was not in a tower, but in the void itself, tumbling through an endless, star-strewn blackness. The illusion was perfect, a gut-wrenching fall that triggered a primal terror, the cold of space searing his lungs. It was a test not of knowledge, but of spirit. Celebrían, who had been observing his precise, frustrated work, did not see flawed calculations. She saw a story in the stars, a melody of light her intuition could almost hear. As Elrond fought the vertigo, his mind scrambling for a logical escape that did not exist, her voice cut through the panic. She described not angles and trajectories, but the flow of the constellations, the dance of the sickle of the valor, and the flight of the swan. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, Elrond faced a critical choice: cling to his own failing, rigid understanding, or surrender to her unproven instinct. He made his decision, a leap of faith greater than the illusory fall. He let her guide his trembling hands, placing the crystals where she directed based on nothing but feeling. The moment the final crystal slid into its intuitive position, the terrifying void snapped away. They were back on the solid tower floor, the mosaic now glowing with a soft, steady light. The shared ordeal had forged a deeper trust between them, a partnership where his scholarship and her insight were no longer separate, but one unified strength. The glowing crystals resolved not into a simple door, but into a magnificent, rotating star map of the ancient sky. It charted a path of exile, tracing the long, sorrowful road of the Noldor out of the blessed realm. And there, woven into the very fabric of the constellations, was the stark, unforgiving text of the Doom of Mandos. This was no mere curse. It was a divine law set into the cosmos itself. The prophecy stated that the blood of their kin would become a curse upon their houses, that their works would fail, and that their very souls would fade as exiles in a mortal land. The fading was not just a slow decay, it was the active working of a sentence passed upon them for the sin of Ulqualanda. Their fate was tied to a decree from the powers of the world. The star map, however, did not end in the heavens. One brilliant point of light descended from the celestial chart, settling over the dark, tangled canopy of a vast forest far to the east, a place where sunlight struggled to touch the earth. The golden light of Lothlorien offered no warmth, only a silent, judgmental beauty. Beneath the towering Malorn trees, whose leaves seemed spun from captured sunlight, Elrond and Celebrían found themselves standing before the Lady Galadriel. Her presence was both a comfort and a trial, an ancient power that saw not their faces, but the shadows in their hearts. She did not greet them as kin, but as a guardian testing a fragile lock. Without words, she led them to a basin of silver filled with water that was not water. This was her mirror, a well of hidden truths and possible ends. She bade them look, not to find an answer, but to prove the strength of their quest by facing what it might cost. Celebrían saw swirling mists and distant, sorrowful partings, but for Elrond, the mirror's surface hardened into a vision of absolute clarity and horror. He saw his own home, the last homely house of Imladris, not as a refuge, but as a ruin. The graceful arches were broken, the halls were empty and open to the sky, and a profound, eternal silence lay over the valley like a shroud. This was not a possible future. It felt like an inevitable one, the direct consequence of his own actions. If he continued on this path, prying into forbidden histories, he might not save his people. He might instead shatter their final sanctuary. The vision presented him with a brutal choice: retreat now and preserve what little remained, or advance and risk, losing everything for a sliver of understanding. The weight of every soul under his protection pressed down upon him. To be a lord was to protect, to build walls against the encroaching dark. Yet he understood that a lord must also sometimes lead his people out of a gilded cage, even if the path leads through peril. He looked from the ruined vision in the water back to Galadriel's unreadable eyes, and he made his choice. He would not turn back. The resolve that settled in his spirit was not a fiery passion, but a cold, unyielding certainty. He would risk the ruin of his home to uncover the reason for his people's ruin. This acceptance of total loss, this willingness to sacrifice his own legacy for the truth, was the proof Galadriel sought. A subtle shift occurred in her demeanor, the stern guardian giving way to the wary ally. She offered her support, but it came with a cryptic and chilling warning. She spoke of a weeping sword, a blade that had tasted the blood of the innocent, and now lay in a place of ancient battle, a place where the earth itself remembered the violence and wept with the memory. This sorrowful weapon, she said, held the final key to understanding the seed of discord, for it was not merely a tool of war, but a witness to the moment kinship truly broke. Their path was now clear, leading away from the golden woods and toward a field of old, unhealed wounds. The mud of Dagorlad was a cold, clinging shroud, sucking at their boots with every heavy step. This was a field of ghosts, a vast plain where the very soil was composed of ancient sorrow and shattered armor. Guided only by the memory of Galadriel's warning, Celebrían knelt in the mire, her hands plunging into the icy, black water that pooled in the footprints of long-dead armies. Her fingers, skilled in the delicate arts of her people, now scrabbled through mud and bone, seeking the cold touch of metal. She found it, a hilt, then a jagged length of blade, buried deep as if ashamed. It was the weeping sword. As she pulled it free, the air did not simply grow cold, it became thick with a palpable malice. The battlefield's memory, a psychic scar left by millennia of rage and despair, did not remain in the past. It awoke and attacked. A wave of pure anguish crashed into their minds, a screaming chorus of every soldier who had fallen here, their final moments of terror and hatred, now a weapon aimed at the living. Elrond staggered, his vision swimming with phantom blows and the searing pain of forgotten wounds. This was not a foe to be fought with steel or spell, but an emotional poison that sought to drown their own spirits in the same bottomless grief. Celebrían, her own heart hammering with the borrowed fear of 1,000 deaths, made a choice. Force had created this echo, and force would only feed it. Closing her eyes against the horrific visions, she began to sing. It was not a song of power or defiance, but a simple, aching melody of release, a lament for the fallen that acknowledged their pain without surrendering to it. Her voice, clear and steady, wove a counterpoint to the spectral screams. She did not battle the despair, she offered it peace. Slowly, the malevolent pressure began to recede. The screaming faded to a whisper, and then to silence. The shadow was not destroyed, but gently dispelled, its energy unraveled by compassion rather than conquered by will. In that moment, their understanding of evil itself shifted. Some darknesses could not be fought, only healed. The cleansed sword, now lying in her lap, no longer felt cold and sorrowful. A faint, silver light hummed along its broken edge, a quiet acknowledgement of its own absolution. Then, the blade moved of its own accord, turning in the mud until its point aimed unerringly toward the frozen, impassable mountains of the far north. The broken sword pointed north, toward the impassable peaks, where the dwarves of Gundabad had delved too deep. The air in the mountain pass was a knife, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on ancient ice. They found the entrance hidden behind a frozen waterfall, a massive stone door, carved with angular runes and a complex lock of interlocking stone gears. This was the northern vault, a repository of records the dwarves had sealed and abandoned, its secrets preserved in the deep freeze. Elrond's fingers, numb with cold, traced the intricate mechanism. It was a puzzle of brute force and delicate timing, a series of counterweights and sliding stones that had to be manipulated in a precise sequence. He had studied such designs in the scrolls of Nogrod, but to see one functioning, even after ages, was another matter entirely. The first gear shifted with a groan that echoed deep into the mountain. It was the wrong sound. From the dark passages behind them came an answering scrape of stone on stone. The vault's ancient guardians, constructs of rock and forgotten magic, were stirring to life. Their heavy, grinding footsteps began to echo, growing steadily closer. This was no longer a test of lore, but a race against a closing trap. Celebrían stood at the passage, her own power forming a shimmering, temporary barrier of light to hold the advancing stone sentinels at bay. But the strain was immense, each blow against her shield causing her to flinch. Elrond worked faster, his mind calculating the permutations, his hands moving the heavy stone gears. He was one step from solving it, the final gear almost in alignment, when the central spindle, worn with age, jammed irrevocably. The mechanism was frozen. The guardians redoubled their assault, and a crack appeared in Celebrían's luminous wall. In that suspended moment, Elrond saw only two paths: retreat and lose the answer forever, or commit fully. His hand went to the sheath at his belt, and he drew not a weapon, but a small, beautifully wrought dagger of Noldoran steel, an heirloom from his father that he had carried for centuries. Without a second thought, he drove the priceless artifact into the jammed mechanism. The metal shrieked, the stone gears grated, and with a final, shuddering groan, the massive door slid open just enough for them to slip through. He had sacrificed a piece of his own history to buy a chance at the truth. Inside, the air was still and frigid, untouched for ages. The vault was not a treasure hoard, but an archive, with stone shelves holding clay tablets and thick, leather-bound ledgers. One volume, bound in black leather and marked with the sigil of a long-dead dwarf lord, lay open on a central pedestal. Elrond brushed the frost from its pages and began to read. The entries were stark, transactional, a cold record of trade. They detailed shipments of elven artifacts, heirlooms of immense cultural and spiritual power, exchanged for raw, unworked mithril. The ledgers did not speak of alliance or friendship, but of a desperate, growing dependency. The elves were trading the very symbols of their identity, the physical anchors of their lineage's memory, for a metal they believed could stave off their fading. This was not an attack from an enemy, but a self-inflicted wound, a slow bleeding of their heritage for a temporary, material solution. It was a history of quiet, willing surrender. Then, on the final page, a single line of text, an unfinished entry, caught his eye. It spoke of a final, monumental trade, a transaction never completed for an object referred to only as the Heart of Silver. The ledger stated it had been lost, its carrier ship going down in a sudden storm off the coast, taking the artifact to a sunken city beneath the waves. The quest was no longer leading them over land, but into the deep, into the drowned kingdom of westernness. The salt of the sea was a cold, constant burn in Celebrían's lungs as she descended into the sunken city. Elendil, the ancient port of Numenor, was a ghost of white stone and skeletal towers, its grandeur now a labyrinth for eels and drifting silt. She moved through collapsed halls where marble benches lay tumbled like children's blocks, her eyes straining in the dim, blue light. Her goal was a sealed tomb, its entrance marked by a carving of a great wave, and within it, the locket of mithril the Dwarven Ledger had called the Heart of Silver. As she swam into the burial chamber, the water grew unnaturally cold, and the swimming shadows around her began to coalesce. A form took shape from the gloom, a guardian spirit of the sea, woven from the grief of a drowned people. It was not a monster of tooth and claw, but a being of pure, sorrowful wrath, its presence a crushing pressure that sought to flood her mind with the same despair that had taken the city. It showed her visions of the great wave, the screams of the proud Númenóreans, the terror of their final moments. The instinct to fight, to defend herself with her own power, was overwhelming. But she remembered the lesson of the weeping sword on Dagorlad. Force would only feed this echo of tragedy. Instead, she opened her spirit, allowing the spirit's sorrow to wash through her without resistance. Then she began to sing. It was not a song of magic, but a simple, heartfelt lament for the lost, a melody that honored the memory of Vinélunde without being drowned by its pain. Her voice, distorted and ethereal through the water, wove a tapestry of remembrance. The spirit's fury faltered. The crushing pressure eased, replaced by a sense of ancient, acknowledged grief. The shimmering form drifted closer, no longer a foe, but a listener, a fellow mourner. As the last note faded, the spirit bowed its luminous head and dissolved, not in defeat, but in peace. The way to the stone sarcophagus was clear. Inside, resting on a bed of silt, was the locket. It was a simple, elegant thing of pure mithril, cool to the touch even through the water. She swam for the surface, the artifact clutched tightly in her hand. On the sun-warmed shore, with Elrond waiting, she examined it closely. There, engraved in fine script on the inside of the locket, was an inscription. It read, "For the light we failed to uphold." This was no grand declaration or royal decree. It was a personal confession, a whisper of guilt from a long-dead Númenórean who had seen their civilization's hubris and fallen into despair. The failure was not an abstract historical event. It was a choice made by individuals, a light let go. The weight of that single line made the entire tragedy feel intimate and devastating. As they contemplated the words, a shimmer appeared on the surface of the water. The sea spirit had not fully departed. In a voice like the gentle lap of waves on a quiet shore, it spoke a single phrase of gratitude, a clue offered for the song that had given it rest. It told them of a hidden haven, a place where the last, faithful Númenóreans had fled before the fall, a sanctuary whose location was lost to all but the sea itself. Their path now led not to another ruin, but to a living refuge, a place where a forgotten branch of the story might still be waiting to be told. The salt spray of the gray havens stung with the scent of pine and farewell. Here, at the edge of the world, the last ships were built for the journey into the west, a slow, solemn procession of elves seeking the undying lands. They found Círdan the shipwright not in a grand hall, but at the end of a weathered dock, his ancient hands resting on a rail, polished smooth by centuries of sea winds. His eyes, the color of a deep and patient ocean, held a knowledge that went beyond lore, into the very rhythm of the tides. Without a word, he led them away from the main shipyards, to a secluded, half-rotted pier, hidden within a rocky cove. This was not a place for grand departures, but for secret beginnings. Beneath a loose plank, slick with moss, lay a heavy, salt-stained logbook, its pages brittle as dried seaweed. Elrond opened it, and the past rose to meet him not as a story, but as a mirror. The entries were not about kings or battles, but about choices. They detailed the agonizing decisions of the Half-Elven, those like himself, caught between two worlds. He read of his own father, Arundel, who chose the path of the Eldar to become a star, and of his brother Elros, who chose the fate of men to become the first king of Numenor. The words laid bare the brutal cost of such a decision, the tearing of a soul in two directions, and then he found his own name, not in a grand chronicle, but in a simple, logistical note recording the day the young lord of Imladris had chosen to be counted among the elves, foregoing the gift of men. He had always known this, of course, but to see it written in this stark, administrative hand made the choice feel fresh and terrifyingly permanent. The book forced him to confront the weight of that decision, not as a point of pride, but as the defining fracture in his own lineage. His children, Arwen, Eladin, and Elrohir, carried this divided heritage within them. Was his choice to remain, to fight a fading war, a noble stand, or was it a failure to let go, trapping his descendants in a twilight existence? The conflict was no longer academic. It was a storm in his own heart. He saw the fading of the Eldar not as something happening to them, but as a consequence of choices like his own, choices that sought to preserve a single, pure thread in a tapestry that was meant to be woven from many. In that moment of profound internal struggle, a clarity washed over him, as cold and bracing as the haven sea. The strength of his people could not lie in purity, in clinging to a single, fading song. Their survival depended on embracing the whole of their story, the human courage and the elven memory, the mortal passion and the immortal sorrow. His mixed blood was not a dilution, it was a bridge. His role was not to be the last pure lord of a dying race, but to become the unifier of a new, more complex hope. The survival of the Eldar would depend on their ability to change, to integrate, to accept that their song must now be sung in harmony with others, or it would not be sung at all. As this resolve settled within him, Círdan, who had been watching the play of understanding on his face, spoke at last. His voice was like the creak of a great ship's timbers. You have seen the choice, and you have chosen your path. But to understand the path ahead, you must first understand the path that was lost. The green elves of Osiriand, the first to fade into the forests, they kept a final testament. It speaks of the world before the sun, and of the first silence that fell. I will tell you where it lies. The air within the woodland realm was thick with the scent of damp earth and suspicion. King Thranduil's court was a fortress of living wood, and its ruler was a wall of cold pride, his gaze as sharp as the obsidian jewels adorning his crown. He saw in Elrond and Celebrían not fellow elves, but outsiders, bearers of the very world weariness he had sought to shut out with his borders. The stalemate was immediate and absolute, a silent battle of wills in the dim, golden light. Then Elrond moved, not with a plea, but with an offering. From a satchel, he produced a small, carefully tended sapling, its leaves a pale, luminous silver. It was a scion of the white tree of Gondor, a symbol of renewal for a kingdom of men, and its presence here, in this secluded elven fastness, was a profound and unexpected gesture. Thranduil's cold mask fractured for a single, unguarded moment. He saw not just a tree, but a future, a legacy that could persist beyond the slow fading of his own people. His fear was not for himself, but for his son, Legolas, and the world of diminished wonders he would inherit. The king's decision to accept the sapling was a quiet surrender to a hope he had long denied. He granted them access to his most private sanctuary, a grove where the oldest trees in the forest stood as silent historians. There, Beneath a canopy of ancient, interlocking branches, they found it. One colossal tree, its bark was not merely rough, but intricately carved with a story that predated the sun and moon. The images told of the Entwives, the shepherds of gardens and orderly fields, and their mysterious loss. It was not a tale of battle, but of a slow, sorrowful parting, a schism in the natural world itself. The land grew silent where they had walked, and the forests of the Ents grew wild with grief. This was a new kind of fading, a divorce between the wild wood and the cultivated earth, a fundamental breakdown in the song of the world. The Firstborn were not declining in isolation. Their fate was woven into this greater, older fracture. The search for the ashes of the Firstborn now demanded they find the echoes of that long-lost song, the forgotten fate of the Entwives. The brown land stretched before them, a desolation of cracked clay and gray dust under a pale, indifferent sky. This was not a place that had died, but one that had been murdered, its vitality scorched away in an age forgotten. Every step was a labor, the brittle earth offering no comfort, the air tasting of ancient ash. It was a trial of spirit as much as body, a direct confrontation with the absolute silence the Entwives had left behind. Celebrían halted, her heart aching at the sheer emptiness. She knew that force, whether of will or magic, was useless here. This land needed not a command, but a conversation. Kneeling, she pressed her palms flat against the parched ground, ignoring the sharp edges of stone. Closing her eyes, she did not summon power, but instead offered a memory. She poured into the cracked soil the sensation of a gentle rain, the image of a tender green shoot unfurling, the very essence of growth that was her deepest connection to the world. It was an act of profound empathy, a giving of her own life force to a place that had known only loss. The effort was immense, a draining of her own light that left her trembling and pale, a temporary sacrifice of her strength. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a miracle, a single, defiantly golden flower pushed up through the dust, its petals soft and vibrant against the monochrome waste. It was a fleeting victory against the decay, a spark of hope in a sea of despair. As the flower bloomed, its fragile stem disturbed the earth, revealing not more dust, but a small, curved shard of pottery. Celebrían lifted it, her fingers tracing its faded pattern of vines and leaves. This was no ordinary fragment. It was a relic from the lost gardens of the Entwives. The message was terrifyingly clear. The fading of the Eldar was not a solitary tragedy. It was one thread in a greater unraveling, a symptom of a world whose fundamental magic was seeping away, beginning with the divorce of the wild woods from the cultivated earth. The connection was undeniable, and the stakes were now immeasurably higher. As they watched, a faint dust of golden pollen lifted from the flower, caught by a sudden, gentle breeze. It did not scatter randomly, but streamed purposefully eastward, a luminous trail pointing like a finger across the barren plains, toward the mysterious and unknown lands of Ruin. The golden pollen settled upon their cloaks like a fine, luminous dust, guiding them east into lands where the very stars were strange. The mountains of Ruin rose like the jagged teeth of the world, and carved into the heart of the tallest peak was a temple so ancient it seemed less built than grown from the stone itself. Within its shadowed halls, the air hummed with a silence that was not empty, but watchful. The oracle was not a person, but a presence, a voice that emanated from the living rock around them, echoing from walls that remembered the first sunrise. It spoke in riddles that twisted back upon themselves, speaking of loss as gain and endings as beginnings, leaving them grasping at phantoms of meaning. Elrond, feeling the weight of their long journey, understood that words alone would not suffice. He opened their pack and carefully laid their gathered proofs upon a smooth, altar-like stone. The stone tablet from Ost-in-Edhil, with its runes of internal schism, the mithril locket from the sunken city, with its confession of failure, the pottery shard from the brown lands that whispered of a world's lost harmony. These silent witnesses together created a chorus of shared sorrow. The moment the last artifact touched the stone, the chamber dissolved. Elrond was no longer in the mountain. He stood on a windswept shore, the salt spray stinging his eyes, watching a scene he had lived through only in memory and dread. There was his brother, Elros, his face not as a king of legend, but as a young man, etched with a terrible and beautiful resolve. Elrond felt the echo of his own heartbreak, a raw, screaming wound from an age past. He saw himself as he was then, reaching out, not in blessing, but in a desperate, frantic attempt to pull his brother back from the precipice of mortality. The vision was a spiritual trial, forcing him to relive not the event, but the conflict, the profound, gut-wrenching grief of watching half of his own soul choose a path of dust and forgetting. The old pain surged, a tide of loneliness and betrayal, but this time, with the wisdom of centuries and the evidence of his quest laid bare before his spirit, he saw a deeper truth. Elrost's choice was not a rejection of him, but an embrace of a different kind of glory, a courage to participate in the grand, tragic, and magnificent story of humanity. In that moment of painful clarity, Elrond made a new choice. He did not clutch at the ghost of his brother. Instead, he let his hand fall, and in his heart, he spoke a silent, profound blessing upon Elrost's chosen path. He accepted the gift of his brother's mortality. As that internal acceptance settled, a profound quiet fell. The spectral shore faded, and the oracle's voice returned, no longer a riddle, but clear and resonant as a bell. The fall of the Eldest Lineages was not a punishment to be reversed. It was a necessary pruning. A great tree, left unmanaged, will grow until it chokes itself, its own weight becoming its downfall. The light of the Firstborn was too potent, too absolute for the changing world. Their gradual fading was the world's way of making space for new life, for the Secondborn, whose brief, passionate flames would bring innovation, courage, and a kind of hope that immortality could never know. Their entire quest was reframed in an instant. It was never about preventing an end, but about understanding a transformation. The goal shifted from stopping the fade to learning how to pass the torch with grace, ensuring that the wisdom of the Eldar would not be lost, but woven into the fabric of the age to come. The oracle's final gift was a single, perfect seed, which drifted down to rest in Elrond's palm. It glowed with a soft inner light, a seed from the fabled tree of Valinor itself, a symbol of a new beginning, born from an accepted end. The Halls of Imladris, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now echoed with the sharp, discordant voices of fear. Elrond and Celebrían stood before a council of the most revered elders, their faces hardened into masks of disbelief and outrage. The proof they had gathered, the artifacts laid upon the great table, were not seen as answers, but as blasphemies. To speak of the kinslaying as a foundational wound, to suggest their fading was a cosmic necessity, to even hint that the strength of men was a thing to be embraced. This was to spit upon the memory of all they had ever been. The air crackled with the tension of a faith about to shatter. An elder named Lindir, his voice trembling with age and anger, pointed a bony finger at the collection. You bring the filth of battlefields and the sorrow of drowned men into our last, pure home. You call this wisdom. It is a poison. In the face of this rising storm, Celebrían did not argue. She simply turned and walked into the central courtyard, the eyes of the entire assembly upon her. In her hand, she held the glowing seed from the oracle. She knelt in the very heart of their refuge, and with her own hands, she dug a small hole in the rich earth. Then, one by one, she placed the artifacts around it, forming a circle of witness. The stone tablet, the mithril locket, the pottery shard, each a testament to a different failure, a different sorrow. She placed the seed in the center, this tiny vessel of pure potential, and covered it with soil. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was heavy with judgment. Then, a tremor passed through the ground. A spear of pure, silver light erupted from the earth, and a sapling surged upward, growing at a visible, impossible rate. Its bark was the color of moonlight, and its leaves shimmered with a soft, internal radiance that pushed back the twilight of the valley. This was not the gentle gold of Lothlorien. This was a new light, fierce and hopeful. The traditionalists recoiled as if struck. This was not their magic. This was change, violent and beautiful, and it terrified them. They cried out for it to be uprooted, to preserve the sanctity of their slow, dignified decline. This is the moment Elrond's leadership was forged anew. He did not plead for understanding. He stepped forward, placing himself between the protesting elders and the growing tree, his voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of a ringing bell. He did not defend their quest. He defended the tree itself. I will not let fear dictate our final chapter, he declared. This light is not an ending, it is a bridge. If we are to fade, let it be as this tree fades its old leaves, not into dust, but to make way for a new spring. Our purpose is not to be the last perfect note of a dying song, but to become the harmony for the music that is yet to come. To stand against this is to choose oblivion over legacy. His words did not silence all dissent, but they cemented a new path. He had redefined their very existence. The fading was not a failure to be mourned, but a transformation to be guided. The stakes were no longer about survival, but about meaning. What would their long ages of wisdom amount to if they took it all with them into the West? As the silver light of the sapling grew brighter, it did not simply illuminate the courtyard. Its beams seemed to coalesce, weaving a path of shimmering air that stretched from its highest branches, not westward toward the undying lands, but downward into the earth and beyond the circles of the world. It pointed a luminous, unerring finger toward the one place where all the threads of elven fate were ultimately gathered, the silent halls of Mandos, where the souls of the departed waited. The final answer would not be found in any library or ruin, but in the very halls of judgment themselves. The silver light of the sapling was not merely a beacon, it was a doorway. Elrond and Celebrían did not walk through it with their bodies, but with their spirits, their consciousness drawn along that shimmering path into a realm of echoes and profound silence. They stood at the threshold of a place that was not a place, before gates that were not of wood or stone, but woven from shadow and memory. These were the Halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the departed elves awaited the ending of the world. The air itself was heavy with the weight of countless untold stories, a sorrow so deep it felt like the bedrock of the world. To cross this threshold uninvited was impossible, but they had not come to enter. They had come to call. Facing the immense, silent gates, Elrond drew a deep, steadying breath and began to speak. He did not recite a list of the dead. He called out their names, one by one, the Teleri elves slain at Elqualendeth. With each name, he offered a fragment of memory, a glimpse of the life that was lost. He spoke of a shipwright who could carve a swan's wing with breathtaking grace, of a singer whose voice could calm the waves, of a young apprentice who had simply been in the wrong place when the fury of the Noldor fell upon them. This was not an accusation. It was an act of remembrance, a long overdue memorial for those whose deaths had been buried beneath layers of shame and justification for ages. The silence of the halls shattered. From beyond the gates came a rising wave of anguish, the collective, chained grief of the Noldor, the killers. It was a storm of guilt and defensive rage that had festered for millennia, a psychic force that sought to overwhelm them, to shout down the names with excuses and reasons. The spirits of his own ancestors challenged Elrond, their spectral voices hissing of necessity, of a stolen destiny, of the greater goal that justified their terrible deed. It was a conflict designed to pull them into the same old argument, to make them choose sides in a war that should never have been. But Elrond and Celebrían stood firm. They let the storm of grief and blame wash over them, acknowledging its power without surrendering to its narrative. They had learned that some shadows cannot be fought, only healed. And so they began to sing. It was the same song of release Celebrían had sung on the field of Dagorlad, the same lament she had offered to the sea spirit, but now woven with the names of the fallen and the understanding won from every step of their journey. It was a melody that held space for both the victim and the perpetrator, a harmony that acknowledged the terrible price paid without demanding further payment. The song did not silence the storm, it gentled it. The raging grief began to still, the defensive anger softened into a weary, shared sorrow. The schism that had cracked the foundation of the Eldar, the seed of discord itself, was not being erased, but it was being soothed. For the first time, since that bloody day on the shores of Elqualendeth, the two sides of the tragedy were not at war in memory, but held together in a single, painful, and healing song. The fate of the lineages had always hinged on this spiritual reconciliation, on the Noldor finally laying down the burden of their guilt, and the Teleri receiving the acknowledgement of their loss. The great gates did not swing open. No host of the dead marched forth, but a single, pure white feather, soft and impossibly light, drifted out from the space between the gates and settled slowly into Elrond's open palm. As it touched his skin, a message filled his mind, not with words, but with a crystalline, undeniable truth. The feather was not a key, but an answer. A single, perfect feather rested in Elrond's palm, its weightlessness holding the gravity of ages. As the final note of their healing song faded, the feather dissolved into a cascade of shimmering motes, which then wove themselves into a scroll of pure, living light. Elrond knew this was not for him alone. He unrolled the luminous text and began to read its words aloud, his voice carrying not just through the spiritual plane to the assembled spirits, but echoing back to the gathered elders in the courtyard of Imladris. The message was not a condemnation or a simple pardon. It was a revelation of intent. The Firstborn were never designed to be eternal monuments, frozen in a single, perfect moment of creation. Their purpose was to be agents of change, to enrich the tapestry of the world through the very fabric of their experiences, their triumphs, and most importantly, their profound mistakes. The kinslaying, the exile, the pride of Numenor, the schism with the Entwives, these were not random tragedies that derailed a perfect destiny. They were the painful, necessary choices that gave their long history its meaning and its weight. The true fall was not the fading, but the stubborn belief that they had fallen from a state of grace they were meant to occupy forever. This was the final decoding. As this understanding settled upon the listeners, a wave of release flowed through the Halls of Mandos. The spirits of the fallen Teleri felt their long-held grief finally witnessed and honored, while the guilt-laden spirits of the Noldor felt the crushing burden of their ancient sin transform into a solemn, accepted lesson. The internal conflict that had fractured their people for millennia simply dissolved, not into nothingness, but into a quiet, collective wisdom. This acceptance was the key that had been missing. Back in the courtyard, the assembled elders watched in awe as the silver sapling responded to the spiritual resolution. A wave of pure, harmonious energy flowed into its roots, and the tree erupted in a breathtaking bloom of radiant flowers, each petal shimmering with the light of a reconciled memory. The stakes of their entire journey were now clear. The survival of their legacy did not depend on stopping the fade, but on this single, conscious choice to embrace their evolving role in the world's story. The silver light did not simply shine, it flowed. It pulsed from the heart of the newborn tree, a wave of liquid radiance that washed over the flagstones of the courtyard and seeped into the very soil of Imladris. Where it touched, the world responded with a sudden, vibrant sigh. Ancient ivy, once merely green, now shimmered with flecks of silver. Flowers long dormant pushed through the earth, their petals unfolding with colors more intense than any seen in an age. The air itself seemed to thicken with a new vitality, carrying the scent of rain, washed blossoms, and clean, energized stone. This was more than beauty. It was a restoration, the land drinking in a light it had been starving for. But light alone is a transient thing. Celebrían understood that for this renewal to take root, it had to be woven into the fabric of the valley, made permanent. She stepped forward, her voice rising once more, not in a lament this time, but in a song of binding. Her melody was a loom, and the silver light was her thread. She sang to the foundations of the homely house, and the stones themselves seemed to hum in resonance, absorbing the radiance until they glowed with a soft, internal warmth. She sang to the waterfalls, and their mist began to glitter with captured starlight. This was a creative, deliberate conflict against the lingering shadows of decline, not by fighting the old darkness, but by stitching a new, brighter pattern directly over it. The valley was being remade, not as a fortress against the world, but as a living conduit to it. As the final notes of her song wove themselves into the last, distant corners of the realm, Elrond joined her beneath the canopy of the luminous tree. The shared journey, the hard-won wisdom, the profound trust forged in fire and shadow, all culminated in this quiet, unspoken understanding. They did not need a grand ceremony or a proclamation. Before the assembled elves, with the revitalized land itself as their witness, they clasped hands and spoke the ancient vows of binding. Their union was far more than a personal commitment. It was a symbol made flesh, the union of Elrond's deep, patient wisdom with Celebrían's instinct for renewal. It was a declaration that the future of the Eldar would not be found in looking backward, but in creating something new together. This personal stake cemented their character growth, transforming them from seekers of a lost truth into architects of a living hope. By formally joining their fates under this new tree, they were planting a seed of a different kind of lineage, one built not on purity of blood, but on the strength of a shared purpose. The act established Imladris not as a fading refuge, but as a new center of power, its strength drawn from connection, from the harmonious blending of memory and possibility, a beacon that would now call out to all who sought to build rather than merely preserve. The news of Imladris did not remain within its wooded valley. It traveled on the wind, carried by messengers to the stone halls of the dwarves and the bustling settlements of men. Elrond had called a new council, and for the first time in living memory, the invitation was extended not just to the Eldar, but to all free peoples. The air in the great hall felt different, charged with a mixture of ancient wariness and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Elrond stood before them, not as a lord guarding secrets, but as a scholar sharing a discovery. He laid out the entire decoded history, the painful truths of Alqualondeh, the Doom of Mandos, the slow trade of heritage for Mithril, and the final reconciliation in the Halls of Mandos. He held nothing back. This radical transparency was a diplomatic gambit that could have shattered the fragile gathering. Some elven elders bristled at the exposure of their deepest shames to outsiders. Certain dwarf lords grumbled that these were elven troubles, not the concerns of the mountain. The conflict was not of swords, but of trust, a millennia-old habit of keeping to one's own kind. Yet by laying the entire truth bare, Elrond transformed the narrative. This was no longer a plea for help from a dying race. It was an offer of shared inheritance. He presented the fading of the Eldar not as an isolated event, but as a pivotal chapter in a story that belonged to everyone. The pride of Numenor was a cautionary tale for the kingdoms of men. The loss of the Entwives was a lesson for all who tended the earth. The kinslaying was a universal warning of what happens when a people believe their destiny justifies any atrocity. The act of sharing the burden of this knowledge forged an unprecedented alliance. It was a covenant built on the understanding that no single race holds the full truth, and that the survival of wisdom itself depends on many hands. From this unity, a momentous decision was born, the founding of a new order. Its purpose would be to preserve all knowledge, elven, dwarven, and human, without preference or prejudice. This was the ultimate safeguard, ensuring the lessons of the past would serve the future of all races, placing the precious legacy of the Eldar into shared custody. The first task of this newborn alliance was a journey of profound symbolism. They would travel to the Grey Havens, to the master charts that guided the elves into the west, and they would amend them. They would inscribe the new truths, the reconciled histories, and the locations of forgotten realms, so that the knowledge of the Firstborn would not vanish over the sea, but remain as a permanent star, by which all future generations could navigate. The scent of salt and old vellum filled the air of the Grey Haven's chart room, a space once reserved for mapping only the straight path into the west. Now Elrond and Círdan stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands not guiding ships away, but altering the very guides that would remain. With careful, deliberate strokes, they inscribed new marks upon the master maps. The falls of Nen Hithol, where water held the memory of bloodshed, was no longer a mere geographical feature. The sunken city of Vinyalanda, where a confession lay in a locket, became a point of moral reckoning. The Eastern Temple in the mountains of Rune, where an oracle spoke in riddles, was now a destination for seekers of truth. Each location was a coordinate in a new kind of navigation, a chart for the soul. This act was a quiet rebellion against the old elven instinct to leave sorrow behind. Some of the departing elves watched with unease, fearing these grim additions would taint the perfection of the undying lands. But Círdan, the ancient shipwright who had waited for ages, made a profound choice. He would delay his own long-awaited departure to oversee this final, crucial work. His commitment transformed the stakes entirely. This was no longer about preserving a legacy for the elves alone. It was about leaving a compass for all who would come after, a way to understand the price of pride and the possibility of reconciliation. As the final shimmering line was drawn, connecting the falls to the sunken city to the temple, a strange quiet fell over the harbor. The very air seemed to still, and the light from the setting sun intensified, becoming not golden, but a pure, clear silver that had no single source. The valor, the powers of the world, had turned their gaze upon this humble act of amendment, and their attention was a silent, overwhelming benediction. A strange, peaceful fog began to gather upon the waters of the Grey Havens, a soft, silver mist that muffled the sounds of the harbor and wrapped the world in a gentle hush. It was not a natural sea fog, for it carried the scent of untouched rain and far-off blossoms, and within its heart, a figure of pure light began to coalesce. This being did not speak with words, but its presence communicated a profound and ancient peace. All who witnessed it, elf, dwarf, and man alike, felt a wave of awe so immense it was humbling, a conflict between the desire to kneel and the urge to reach out. The figure turned its luminous gaze not to the waiting ships, but inward, toward a vision that bloomed in the air before them all. There stood the silver sapling of Imladris, its branches shimmering in the courtyard they had just left behind. The being of light extended a hand, and as its fingers, formed of pure radiance, gently touched the highest branch of the tree, a miracle unfolded. The sapling, which had borne only light, now swelled with life, its branches suddenly heavy with clusters of fruit that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. The fruit was not for the undying lands. It was a gift for the soil of Middle-earth. In that breathtaking moment, Elrond faced a critical choice. The traditional interpretation, the one etched into the very soul of his people, would see this as a summons, a divine sign that their work was done and their place was now in the West. But as he looked from the blessed tree back to the diverse faces of the new alliance, he understood a deeper truth. The blessing had not come to call them away, but to confirm their path. It was a validation that their choice to stay, to bind their fate to the mortal world and its peoples, was not a rejection of the divine, but a new kind of sacred duty. This realization fundamentally shifted the elves' relationship with the undying lands. It was no longer the only source of grace and light. Hope was no longer a thing to be sought across the sea, but a seed to be nurtured where they stood. The stakes were now irrevocably anchored in the mortal world, their purpose intertwined with its future. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, the luminous fog began to lift, dissolving into the clean, salt-tinged air. It left behind no physical token, but something far more valuable, a profound and unshakable sense of peace and purpose that settled deep into the hearts of all present. The singular fruit hung from the silver branch, a perfect orb of captured light. With a reverence that held the weight of their entire journey, Celebrían reached up and gently plucked it. It was warm in her hand, pulsing with a soft, steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. She did not present it to Elrond or to the elf lords. Instead, she carried it to a stone table at the center of the courtyard and drew a small, gleaming knife. The eyes of every representative elf, dwarf, man, and the solitary, ancient Ent who had come were fixed upon her. This was a conflict against centuries of instinct, a quiet battle against the deep-seated belief that the power of the Eldar was theirs alone to guard. With precise, deliberate cuts, she divided the luminous fruit into equal portions, its inner light spilling out like liquid starlight. The act itself was a declaration, a radical sharing of their most sacred renewal. One by one, the delegates stepped forward. A dwarf lord, his hands calloused from stone and forge, accepted his peace. A chieftain of men, whose life was measured in swift seasons, took his share. The great Ent, his bark-like fingers moving with slow care, received his fragment. Finally, the elves themselves partook. The decision to eat together, to consume this gift of reconciled history as one body, forged a bond more tangible than any treaty. It was a physical covenant, a mingling of their very essence with the fate of the land itself. As the fruit was consumed, a shared vision washed over them, not as a dream, but as a collective certainty. They saw a future not of separate races, but of intertwined destinies, where the long memory of the elves guided the bold courage of men, and the deep delving strength of dwarves supported the slow, patient wisdom of the forests. The old lines of elder and younger were blurred into irrelevance, replaced by the single, shining thread of common cause. The fading of the Firstborn was no longer a solitary end, but a transformation that would strengthen the whole. The soft glow of the silver sapling illuminated Elrond's study, a single, steady flame in the deep night. He sat at his desk, a fresh quill in hand, and a stack of blank vellum before him. He was not merely preparing to write another chronicle for the archives of Imladris. He was beginning a new kind of book, one he would call the Ashes of the Firstborn. The act of writing was no longer a passive record of what had been lost. It was an act of deliberate creation. Each word he chose was a stitch in a new tapestry, a narrative woven not from the threads of tragedy, but from the stronger, more resilient fiber of hope. The decoded truths of their long journey, the kinslaying, the doom, the silent departure of the Entwives, all of these were his materials. But how would he frame them? The old, familiar temptation whispered to him to write it as a lament, a beautiful, sorrowful elegy for a dying people. That would have been the easier path, a final, poetic sigh. But that would have been a betrayal of everything they had learned. He made his choice, a quiet but resolute conflict, against the weight of millennia of elven grief. He would write a history of transformation, not of termination. He would tell the story of how a people learned to let their light change, to become a dawn for others rather than a lingering sunset for themselves. This decision carried immense stakes. By choosing to make this volume accessible, by writing it in the common tongue and ensuring its copies would travel to the libraries of men and the halls of dwarves, he was surrendering the old elven power of exclusive knowledge. He was placing the most transformative story his people possessed into the hands of the many. The power of this narrative would no longer be hoarded. It would be shared, interpreted, and perhaps even misunderstood, but in that risk lay its true purpose. It would become a seed itself, planted in countless minds, its growth unpredictable but vital. As he wrote late into the night, the silver light glinting off his ring, he was not sealing the past in a tomb. He was building a bridge, and he was giving the map to everyone. A young woman named Alara stood at the edge of the Bruinen, her worn travel cloak damp with river mist. She was no warrior or princess, but a scholar from a distant village of men, her pack heavy not with treasure, but with scrolls and her own painstaking research on the history of the Edain, the fathers of her people. The rumors of a new history being written in the hidden valley had called to her, a siren song she could not ignore, to brave the wilds and present her humble work to the legendary Lord Elrond was either the height of folly or the beginning of a new understanding. When she was finally led into the Hall of Fire, the air itself seemed to test her resolve, thick with the weight of ages and the silent, judging gaze of the Eldar. She felt impossibly small, a fleeting breath in a room of ancient stone and immortal memory. Unrolling her scrolls before Elrond, her voice trembled only for a moment. She spoke not of elven glory, but of human perseverance, of the forgotten villages and quiet heroes of her own lineage, stories she had pieced together from fragments and folk tales. The conflict in the room was palpable, a silent clash between the old pride of the elves and this new, raw curiosity. An elder scoffed quietly, questioning what a mortal, whose life was a single season, could possibly teach the Firstborn about history. But Elrond listened, his eyes seeing not her youth or her race, but the earnest light of a kindred spirit. He saw in her work a vital piece of the tapestry he was trying to weave, the perspective of the very people for whom this new legacy was intended. His decision was immediate and profound. He would accept her not as a guest, but as the first official apprentice of the new order. This was the ultimate test of his evolved philosophy, moving it from grand council speeches to a single, personal commitment. By taking a human girl under his tutelage, he was demonstrating the practical application of shared custody over knowledge. The arrival of Alara signaled that the legacy of the Eldar was no longer a relic to be preserved, but a living seed to be planted in fresh soil. The fading of the eldest lineages was no longer a slow dimming, but a deliberate act of cross-pollination, giving rise to a new, hybrid wisdom that was only possible because of the fall. What new truths would be uncovered when elven memory was filtered through a mortal heart? The weeping sword rested on a velvet-lined stand in the forges of Imladris, no longer a jagged shard of sorrow, but a quiet, humming promise. Elven smiths, whose hands were accustomed to shaping elegance and light, stood beside master dwarven artisans, their fingers more familiar with the stubborn strength of mountain ore. Together, They contemplated the broken blade, its edge still whispering with the memory of its violent past. The initial conflict was not of fire and hammer, but of philosophy. The dwarves saw the inherent strength in the steel, a quality too valuable to waste, and argued for reforging it into a new, greater weapon, a shield for the Alliance. The elves, their senses still tender from the artifact's painful echoes, recoiled at the idea of returning any part of it to a martial purpose. They saw only the lingering stain of bloodshed. This creative clash forced a profound question upon them all. Could they truly honor this object's history by simply changing the form of its violence, or was a more radical transformation required? The answer came not from one side or the other, but from the shared space between their cultures. A young dwarven apprentice, watching the debate, spoke of how the deepest minds eventually give way to the great halls where families gather. An elven loremaster recalled that the most beautiful gardens often grow from soil once scarred by fire. In that moment, the collective decision crystallized. They would not reforge the sword into another instrument of war. They would reforge it into a plowshare. The act itself was a ritual of healing. The dwarves brought the heat of their deep mountain forges, a purifying flame that did not destroy but softened the blade's ingrained malice. The elves sang songs of growth and renewal as they worked, their melodies guiding the hammer falls, weaving intentions of peace directly into the molten metal. They were not erasing the sword's history, they were redeeming it, channeling all its gathered strength away from division and toward nourishment. The final shape they created was both strange and beautiful, a curved blade of dark, resilient steel that gleamed with a faint, silvery light along its edge, a permanent reminder of the compassion that had cleansed it. The first field chosen for its use was a stony, reluctant patch of earth on the valley's outer edge, land that had never yielded more than thistle and scrub. When the newly forged plowshare bit into that stubborn ground, it did not simply turn the soil, it seemed to soothe it. The earth parted willingly, and a rich, dark fragrance rose from the furrows, a scent of vitality long dormant. The seeds sown there, a mix of elven star grain and a hardy dwarven barley, did not just grow, they erupted. The barley stalks grew as thick as a dwarf's wrist, their heads heavy with golden kernels. The star grain shimmered with an internal light, each plant a tiny beacon. The harvest was not merely abundant, it was miraculous, a tangible, undeniable sign that the choice to build, rather than to preserve or to fight, could yield blessings beyond any warlike glory. An instrument of death had been reborn as a source of life, proving that the future they were building could literally spring from the redeemed ashes of the past. The slow, deep creak of an ancient ent was a sound that usually spoke of patience, of roots delving deep into the memory of stone, but in the restored groves of Lothlorien, that sound was changing. It was finding a counterpoint in the bright, fluid melody of an elven flute, played by Celebrían. Their music was a conversation across ages, a creative conflict where the forest's profound, deliberate rhythm met the swift, intricate patterns of the Eldar. At first, their notes seemed to clash, the ent's grounding hum threatening to swallow the flute's delicate silver threads, the flute's quickness seeming to rush the tree shepherd's timeless pace. This was the friction of two different natures, the deep earth and the quickening air, struggling to find a shared language, yet they did not force their own ways. The Ent learned to leave spaces in his long, resonant tones, and Celebrían wove her melodies into those open moments, her notes becoming vines that climbed the sturdy structure of his song. Their decision to blend these disparate musics was a quiet defiance of an ancient separation, a choice to build something new from what had been kept apart for millennia. When they finally performed the completed harmony for the assembled peoples, the effect was not merely beautiful, it was transformative. Elves who had always seen the Ents as distant, strange beings felt the deep, patient love of the forest in the music's foundation. The Ents, in turn, perceived the vibrant, hopeful spirit of the Eldar not as a fleeting distraction, but as a vital spark. The old, unspoken rift between the children of Yavanna and the Firstborn began to mend, not through words, but through a shared vibration that resonated in the very core of their beings. As the final, unified note hung in the golden air, the Malorn trees themselves responded. Their leaves, usually a tapestry of captured sunlight, began to glow with a soft, internal silver light, as if the stars themselves were blooming among the branches. This was not the borrowed light of the two trees, but a new luminescence, born from a union that the world had not witnessed since its earliest days. The magic of the world was not a fading resource to be hoarded, but a living force that could be renewed, amplified, and rekindled through such deliberate acts of harmony. The silver light from the grove seemed to gather itself into a single, shimmering column before Elrond. Within its heart, a form took shape, a woman of such grace and sorrow that his own breath caught in his chest. It was Arwen, his daughter, yet not as he knew her. This was an Arwen of a future not yet written, her eyes holding a storm of conflict he had only ever feared. She stood at a crossroads of the spirit, torn between the undying light of the Eldar and the passionate, mortal flame of a love he could not yet see. The vision was a mirror held up to his own ancient choice, but reflected through the heart of his child, and the pain of it was a fresh, sharp wound. He saw the immense cost of either path, the eternal parting, or the acceptance of a final, bitter loss. The old instinct, the lordly desire to shield her from such a terrible burden, rose within him like a wave. He could, in that moment, have willed the vision to show him a command, a decree that would force her onto the safer, immortal road, but the hard-won wisdom of his long journey stayed his hand. He remembered the feather from Mandos, the acceptance of his brother's choice, the understanding that a legacy of control was a hollow inheritance, and so Elrond made a different decision. He did not speak a word of guidance or caution to the shimmering form of his daughter. Instead, he poured all his love, all his hard-won peace, into a silent, unconditional blessing. He gave her the gift he himself had needed for so long, the freedom to choose her own meaning, to define her own sacrifice. It was the ultimate act of love, to release his most precious treasure to a destiny he could not control. As the blessing settled upon the vision, the conflict in Arwen's eyes did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a torment, but a solemn, accepted weight. Her choice, whatever it would be, was now hers to carry with strength, fortified by a father's love that asked for nothing in return. The luminous figure of his daughter faded slowly, but the profound peace she left behind was more solid than the stone of Imladris. Elrond knew then that the true inheritance of the lineages was not a bloodline preserved in amber, but this sacred, terrifying gift of choice, given freely across the generations. The stakes of their entire quest were now written in the future heart of his own child. What new world would be built upon such choices? The cold, clear sky above Imladris was no longer a vault of distant, silent lights. It had become a canvas, and the elves held the brush. Guided by the star map from the Eastern Temple, the lore masters of Elrond's house and the singers of Lothlorien gathered on the highest terrace, their faces turned upward in a shared, solemn purpose. This was not an act of mere remembrance, but a creative battle against the erosion of their very essence. Their collective memory, once a flame guarded in isolated hearts, would now be forged into something eternal, a story written in fire where no hand could erase it. The decision to inscribe their truth upon the heavens was a declaration that their meaning would not vanish with their fading forms. The stakes were the immortality of their legacy, a testament that would speak to ages and peoples they would never know. They began to sing, not a single melody, but a complex harmony woven from the many threads of their decoded past. The song held the grief of Ulqualanda, the weight of the doom, the quiet hope of the silver sapling, and the profound peace of reconciliation. As their voices rose, a wondrous conflict unfolded in the firmament. The familiar stars seemed to resist, their ancient patterns clinging to old stories. But the focused will of the Eldar, a power born of unity rather than individual strength, began to gently pull the celestial bodies into a new alignment. It was a slow, painstaking act of collective will, each elf pouring their spirit into the song, guiding the starlight into a new and permanent pattern. When the last note faded, a new constellation blazed in the northern sky. It was not a warrior or a king, but a figure of quiet purpose, an elf kneeling to plant a single, luminous seed into the dark soil of the night. They named it the Sower. This eternal image now offered its silent lesson to all who would gaze upon it, a promise that the end of one story is always the beginning of another. The new constellation, the Sower, blazed in the northern sky, its silent promise echoing the quiet resolve that now settled in Círdan's ancient heart. For millennia, his purpose had been singular and sorrowful, to build the white ships that carried his people away from the fading world. He was the architect of farewells, his shipyards a place of beautiful, heartbreaking endings. But the light of that new star pattern, a figure planting hope in the void, reframed his entire existence. He stood on his weathered dock, the salt wind pulling at his beard, and made a vow not to the past, but to the future. He would build a new kind of vessel. This was a profound conflict with his age-old duty, a quiet rebellion against the very purpose that had defined him since the First Age. The Grey Havens would no longer be just a gateway out of the world. It would become a harbor for connection. His decision to dedicate his remaining years, which were still countless, to fostering ties along the coasts of Middle-earth was a monumental shift. It redefined the meaning of his home and his craft, escalating the stakes of the entire endeavor. If the legacy of the Eldar was now a shared one, then their wisdom needed to travel, not just apart. He walked into his shipyard, not to select timber for a graceful swan-prowed vessel meant for the straight road, but for something sturdier, broader of beam, designed for the rough and familiar waters of mortal shores. The first of these new ships took shape under his gnarled hands, its hull a testament to resilience rather than escape. and when the time came to paint its name upon the prow, he chose one that held the weight of all their decoded history. He named it the Ash's Hope. This ship would not flee the embers of the past, but would sail forth to fan them into a new and different fire. The artifacts of their long journey found their final home in the open air, beneath the silver canopy of the Sapling. Elrond carried the stone tablet from Ost-in-Edhil, its runes still whispering of internal schism. Celebrían brought the mithril locket from the sunken city, its inscription a quiet confession of failure. They laid them on simple stone pedestals, alongside the pottery shard from the brown lands and the reforged plowshare, its dark steel still humming with redeemed purpose. This was not an act of entombment, but of presentation. A sharp debate had preceded this moment, a final conflict between the old instinct to guard their sorrows in sealed archives and the new courage to display them as public lessons. Some argued that exposing their deepest shames, the kinslaying, the pride, the slow trade of their heritage, would only weaken their standing in the eyes of dwarves and men. But the communal decision, reached after days of quiet discourse, was to build not a tomb, but a classroom without walls. The shrine would have no roof, because the lessons it held were meant to be touched by the rain and warmed by the sun, accessible to any who sought them. This decision transformed the stakes of their entire history. The fall of the Firstborn was no longer a private grief or a secret to be carried over the sea. It became a teachable truth, a chronicle of pride, failure, and redemption laid bare for the world to see. Soon, the first pilgrims arrived. They were not all elves. A dwarf lord, having heard the tale of the weeping Sword Reforged, came to lay a hand upon the plowshare, his brow furrowed in deep thought. A company of rangers from the north, descendants of Numenor, stood in silence before the mithril locket, contemplating the price of a light failed. They came not to worship, but to understand, to draw wisdom from the displayed ashes of a civilization, so they might avoid its fate. The shrine beneath the silver tree became a living heart of the new alliance, its very existence a promise that the greatest legacy is not a perfect history, but an honest one, offered freely to the future. The shadow that fell upon the valley was not an absence of light, but a devouring of it. It seeped from the earth around the silver sapling, a creeping blight of pure negation that withered the grass and silenced the birdsong. This was Sauron's final argument, a last, desperate echo of his will, aimed not at a fortress or an army, but at the living symbol of a reconciled future. The very air grew heavy and cold, promising not death, but unmaking. Elrond, Celebrían, and their gathered allies felt the assault not on their skin, but in their spirits, a chilling whisper that sought to unravel the new truths they had so carefully woven. The instinct to fight back with raw power, to meet force with force, was a primal urge, yet they knew that to do so would be to validate the shadow's logic, to engage in the very conflict that had birthed it. This was the ultimate test of their decoded history. Their defense could not be a battle, it had to be a reaffirmation, so they began to sing. It was not one song, but a tapestry of many. Celebrían's voice wove the memory of the cleansed weeping sword and the lament for the sea spirit. Elrond's deep tones carried the acceptance from the Halls of Mandos and the blessing he had given his daughter's future choice. But as the shadow pressed in, its corrosive presence threatening to mute their melody, Elrond faced the pivotal moment. He realized their elven song, for all its beauty, was still a single thread. To save their hope, they had to embody the very unity they preached. In a breathtaking act of spiritual surrender, he opened the song, not just with his voice, but with his entire being, becoming a conduit. He channeled the steadfast gratitude of the men who now tended the fields with the reforged plowshare. He wove in the unyielding endurance of the dwarves, their strength drawn from the heart of the mountain. He invited the slow, patient rhythm of the Ents, the deep memory of the forests. The song transformed. It was no longer an elven lament, but a symphony of Middle-earth itself. The harmony that rose to meet the shadow was complex and potent, filled with the clang of hammers, the rustle of barley, the creak of ancient boughs, and the quick, hopeful beating of mortal hearts. This collective resonance did not push the darkness back. It unmade it. The blight, which fed on isolation and purity, could find no purchase in this rich, interconnected tapestry of being. It frayed at the edges, dissolving into harmless mist before the chorus of shared existence, and then it was simply gone. As the last tendril of shadow vanished, the silver sapling did not merely recover. It erupted in a radiance that outshone the sun, its leaves now gleaming with the light of 1,000 reconciled stars. The victory was absolute, and it proved, beyond any doubt, that the strength of the lineages was never in their isolated glory, but in the beautiful, unbreakable web of their enriched connections. The silver light of the sapling fell upon the open pages of the finished book, its title etched in a simple, elegant hand, The Ashes of the Firstborn. Elrond stood for a long moment in the quiet of his study, his fingers resting on the cover. The weight of the volume was not in its pages, but in the journey they contained, a chronicle of sorrows transformed into a map for the future. He then carried it out into the heart of a transformed Imladris. The last homely house was no longer a quiet refuge for elves alone. The courtyards now echoed with the deep, rolling debates of dwarven masons and the quick, curious questions of human scholars. The air smelled of parchment, forged smoke, and the rich earth of the miraculous new fields. This was no longer a sanctuary against the world, but a vibrant, living crossroads within it. He found the young human scholar, Ilara, in the library, her head bent over a scroll detailing dwarven rune craft, her own notes scattered beside it. She looked up as he approached, her eyes, once filled with trepidation, now alight with a calm and confident understanding. Without a word, Elrond extended the book to her. This was not the gift of a teacher to a student, but the passing of a trust from one guardian of history to another. Her hands, which had once trembled while presenting her own humble research, now received the heavy tome with a steady grace. In that quiet exchange, the long quest found its peaceful resolution. The fall of the Eldest Lineages was decoded, its meaning no longer locked in elven lament, but translated into a universal lesson. Their decline was not an end, but the necessary making of fertile ground, the rich ash from which a new, interconnected world could take root. A profound emotional closure settled over Elrond, a quiet warmth that held both the memory of ancient sorrows and the bright promise of the future he had helped to seed. As Ilara held the book to her chest, the enduring light of the sapling seemed to gather in its silver leaves, a gentle, pulsing glow that whispered of stories yet to be written and an ever-unfolding future.